Hello and welcome back, political scientists, to A5, no longer in the white void. And this means that we're doing the second lesson second or third? Third lesson on the powers of the PM and the executive. Now, I've talked about what the powers are, I've talked about where they come from. What I'm going to do today is my favourite bit, and I've been hinting at it quite strongly, is this idea of ministerial responsibility. Now, I had intended to do this in a single hour lesson, or half an hour's input, but in making the PowerPoint, I'm not even sure I'm going to get through the whole PowerPoint in half an hour. I'll see how I go anyway, and we'll make notes as we go as normal. So, the task I asked you to do about creating the cabinet, I did make an error on that. Thank you to who pointed that out, they know who they are, in that I said that Boris Johnson's last government job was in 2019. It wasn't. His last government job was in 2018. So, my error. Sorry about that. So in each of those, I asked you why they'd been in the news recently, and it was, or things that they'd done with their power. And I sort of hinted strongly at potential scandals and issues that they may have faced. Why I was doing that wasn't just because I hate all governments. It was also, and I do, it's also because it tells us something about ministerial responsibility and the different types of ministerial responsibility. So, without further ado, let's start talking about responsibility. Now, ideally, and I'm going to put the links down below, you're going to play the links in the order I put them up. I've put this on the Show My Homework section as well, so you can click it on the PowerPoint if you prefer. But the first thing I'd like to look at is the one entitled Johnson on Responsibility, this link here. So, pause the video and go watch that video now. Okay, I'm going to assume you've had time to watch that video. In that video, and it's only very short, Boris Johnson expresses that he will take total responsibility for everything the government has done to protect lives during the coronavirus pandemic. He says he's sorry that we've reached that rather awful milestone of 100,000 deaths. He then says the British government did everything it could to prevent loss of life. If Boris Johnson is taking personal responsibility, I'm just going to point you in the direction of some unrelated news from the Daily Express in December. I'll leave you to read those headlines. But it interestingly shows us one aspect of this idea of responsibility. We have come to expect that government won't actually take responsibility for its own decisions, even when it says that's what it's doing. But that isn't normal. This hasn't really been a feature of government until, well, reasonably recently. And what I need to talk about is ministerial responsibility and why that might still be a thing. My background image, by the way, is Theresa May cabinet meeting at Chequers, the retreat of the Prime Minister from 2018, because I thought, just something different in the background. So let's talk about types of ministerial responsibility. The first of these types is individual responsibility, and that might be as far as I get today. Cabinet ministers take responsibility for the department that they run. Remember, the Department of State, the bit of the government that deals with an area of state. And responsibility in this case tends to mean blame, but it can also be good. They can also take credit for anything the department does that goes down well or is popular or solves a problem that needed solving. I'm just going to move the camera slightly to improve the lighting. And that's understood. So if someone's in charge of a department, it's their responsibility to report on what happens in that department, and it's their responsibility if things go wrong, just as much as it's their responsibility if things go right. They can say, look what I have done in my tenure as, Foreign Secretary, or that went wrong in my tenure as Home Secretary, and they take responsibility for that. Even if they're relatively new to the position, they have to be across their brief. They have to understand what's going on. That's why they get advised by the civil service. That's why you've got a permanent secretary whose job it is to keep you informed and ensure that you're able to do what is necessary when it is necessary and, well, do the next bit, which is to respond honestly to questions in Parliament or written queries that are submitted to your department. They have to be honest with other people in Parliament because Parliament has to make the decisions. Remember, Parliament is sovereign. So you have to be able to respond to those questions with information that would allow those politicians to make those decisions as effectively as they can. That's kind of the deal. They also have to justify the actions of their department. So even if they don't agree with something the department did, or policy has changed, or they're new to the position, they have to justify what happened in that department. Therefore, they need to be informed, and they need to be informed impartially. They have to be able to give an account of what a department has done. And finally, they're the ones that appear before select committees and answer the questions that a select committee may have about that area of state. If you remember, a select committee shadows a government department, a Department of State, and asks the Secretary of State to give evidence. Now, the Secretary of State might not personally take responsibility for these things. They can delegate to junior ministers to give those answers, but those answers must still be honest. They must still justify the actions of the department, and they must still give evidence to select committees. Ultimately, though, a junior minister is not expected to resign if they are following orders of a Secretary of State. Rather, they only resign where they deviate from that instruction, or they make a mistake that they had no way of, that the Secretary of State can have no way of controlling. But even then, the Secretary of State is expected to take responsibility for their junior ministers. They're expected to ensure they do as is told. The second form of ministerial responsibility is collective, and this is where cabinet ministers must publicly support the government. When they have a cabinet meeting, like here in Chequers, it's an important meeting, I will be coming back to this later, they do so in private. What goes on in cabinet stays in cabinet. They have the discussion, they formulate the policy, and when the policy is published, all ministers must support that policy. They cannot say, I was the lone voice of reason against the insanity of other people in the cabinet, because they agreed to it. If they cannot agree to it, then they must resign. That's the deal. They can only disagree with government policy if they are no longer in government. Otherwise, what's the point in being in government? Anybody could say anything they like, a government line could come out, and half the cabinet, if it proves to be unpopular, can simply abandon it and pretend like they were never part of it. And that is kind of destabilising to a political system. So it's not a rule, there's no law, it's part of the ministerial code, and we'll talk about collective ministerial responsibility. It's one of my favourite parts of this part of the course, so I'm quite keen to get to it. I probably won't get there today, we'll see how we go. I'm 6 minutes in. It's 8 minutes in even. So this also means if a government loses a vote of no confidence, then all government ministers must resign. They can't say, well, it was nothing to do with me, Gov, and hang around and form a caretaker government. So again, it's a convention, but the last time it happened in 1979, all the government resigned. They adhered to this convention that no one's sticking behind and becoming just a caretaker government on their own. If they can't all agree in public, then they must resign. I'm just going to make that point again and make sure you've written it down. Why? Well, it's unity. There's strength in unity. Take May's government, which had only 2 high-profile resignations up until mid-2018, and then it all exploded towards the end of 2018. But when those resignations happened, they destabilised the government. A slew of resignations of the EU withdrawal bill as a result of this meeting in Chequers destabilised May's government to the point that she had to call, well, she wanted to call another election, but she'd already lost one in 2017, and basically did for her authority. She became a manager rather than a prime ministerial leader. Again, more about that later. Contrast that with Corbyn, never really a minister in charge of ministers, but he also suffered the destabilising effects of shadow ministers quitting. Had he been in government, we would have seen more of the same. Contrast that with Blair and his time in power between 1997 and 2007, and what you found there was actually a surprisingly resilient administration that weathered all manner of storms that would have toppled previous governments. The Iraq War issue in 2003 was 5 years before Blair resigned. Why? Because his cabinet was unified. There were few resignations that were surprises, and Therefore it looked good. So there is strength in unity in public, and therefore it behooves cabinet members to resign if they cannot support the government line in public. So let's talk about individual ministerial responsibility. You'll see by the size of the box, there's not a great deal to write down, but there is a lot of detail in the examples I'm going to be talking about. There are two types of individual ministerial responsibility, because of course there are. The first type is down to administrative failure, when a department makes mistakes. And our example is Sir Dugdale, who was MP and Minister for Agriculture in 1954. And this was down to the Crichel Down affair. Basically what happened was, following the Second World War, the government had taken control of large tracts of private land for war purposes. Over the next few years, that land had to be returned to the rightful owners if the government didn't have a reason to maintain control of that land. One area was an area known as Crichel Down. Crichel Down was supposed to go back to some landowners, but the Department of Agriculture made a mistake. The civil servants basically fudged the records and gave it back to the wrong people. Worse than that, after giving it back to the wrong people, they didn't notice their error, and when the original people who owned the land raised an objection, they, not believing themselves to have made a mistake, simply ignored it. It came out that this was a catastrophic failure of administration. Crichel Down was returned to the original owners, the rightful owners, but in so doing, Sir Dugdale resigned. And he said the following. He said, "I, as Minister, must accept full responsibility for any mistakes and inefficiency of officials in my department, just as, when my officials bring off any successes on my behalf, I take full credit for them." So rather than sack the officials that made the mistakes, Sir Dugdale argued that no, it was his responsibility. He resigned. Remember, civil servants are anonymous and therefore able to be more impartial. The second form is down to policy failure, when decisions are made by a department that pursue a particular direction, and that failure leads to problems later on, so the wrong approach or the wrong politics. Lord Carrington in 1982 was the Foreign Secretary under Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. And after the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands, large tracts of the press and Parliament criticised what had gone on before the Falklands in the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office had basically withdrawn military protection and patrolling around the Falkland Islands, along with military cuts at home. They'd known about General Galtieri's desire to invade the Falklands and had basically said nothing in public. They had issued no censure, they had not criticised it in the UN meetings, and basically General Galtieri took that as a green light. This, apparently, led to the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Now, Lord Carrington, as part of the Foreign Office, had said that the Foreign Office supported the military cuts at home to save money and balance the budget. So, he then resigned for policy failings in the Foreign Office, in not being mean enough to the Argentinians, and he said of it as the following: "In my view, much of the press and parliamentary criticism for the policy in the Falklands is unfounded. But I have been responsible for the conduct of that policy, and I think it right that I should resign." Basically, he resigned on a matter of honour. His resignation was accepted. It was a policy failure of the Foreign Office, and therefore he took responsibility for it, even though he believed they'd done entirely the right thing, and the problem lay almost entirely with the Argentinians for invading the Falkland Islands, which you could argue is fair. So they're my first two examples. But you can have counter-examples. Talking about policy failures, here we have Norman Lamont, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1992, during Black Wednesday. Black Wednesday was when the British were forced to leave the European regulation of a state of was it ER? I forget what ERM stands for. It's ERM. And ERM was a sort of trading in currency, and it devalued British currency, the pound sterling, by leaving. It caused an economic collapse and a recession. And even though, to try and stay in it, he'd taken decisions like raising interest rates by 5%. Now, to put that in perspective, that's great if you're a saver, but it's rubbish if you're a homeowner. People found themselves in what we call negative equity. That is, they'd taken a mortgage out on their house and were paying back mortgage repayments based on the value of that house. If you then raised interest rates by 5%, that meant you could be paying back per month far more than you could afford. You never prepared to pay that extra 5%. You might have gone in with a 7% interest rate. You are now at 13%. That was an increase in your monthly payments of up to £1,000. People couldn't necessarily afford that if they're only paying, say, £600 to begin with. So this rapidly increased the amount of money people were spending. And it caused massive, massive economic problems. Lamont was closely associated with the crisis. He'd made the decision to remove the British currency from the ERM. We called it crashing out. He made the decision to raise interest rates. He'd caused a depression in many ways. But he refused to resign, and he argued that he was simply following the government policy, and said if John Major, the then Prime Minister, wasn't going to resign, then he saw no reason why he should either, because he was following the government policy line. It wasn't a policy failure of his department. That was it. He said the responsibility is not mine. I was following orders, Gov. If the Prime Minister doesn't resign, I shouldn't resign either. And that's it, he toughed it out. He stayed in position. He later resigned in 1993. The pressure grew, and eventually he resigned because the Prime Minister said, well, I'm going to shuffle you away from the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Lamont said, well, I don't see why I could be put in any other position. Obviously, you want me to resign, I will resign. He was basically trying to damage John Major. It was internal politics. But his argument that it wasn't his department's issue is a valid one. You could also look at operational failures, administrative failures, as mistakes. Here we have Michael Howard, who was then Home Secretary in 1995. There had been a series of mass breakouts at Parkhurst Jail, and this was causing public pressure for him to resign. He refused, and instead sacked the Director General of the Prison Service, a man called Derek Lewis. Derek Lewis, he said, was operationally responsible for the breakouts. In other words, he was sacking what he saw as a man who'd failed to do what he'd ordered him to do correctly. That man, Derek Lewis, took Michael Howard to court for wrongful dismissal, saying that he'd been threatened by Michael Howard not to carry out policy that Michael Howard said he told him to do, and that he'd been threatened with the sack. Now, what the truth of that is, I don't know, but Lewis won the wrongful dismissal case, and it led to a fantastic interview, a very interesting, well, a famous interview anyway, with Jeremy Paxman interviewing Michael Howard. The entire interview is in that YouTube clip. It's well worth watching. It's got the famous bit where he asks the same question of Michael Howard about 17 times, I think, and it's now you know what the scandal is, you might get a better idea of why that was such a bombshell interview at the time. And it's not just Paxman's interviewing technique that makes it bombshell. It's Howard's defence of not resigning. So, pause the video and go and watch that interview now. I'm going to assume you've seen the interview. And you can see Michael Howard's defence that it wasn't his operational failing that led to the mass breakouts, but the failing of Derek Lewis. As a consequence, he argued, he did not need to resign. It was a deliberate an obvious fault elsewhere, so you sack the people directly responsible for it. That was his argument for that. What's the significance of this? Well, these are all old examples. So here are some modern ones to show that actually ministerial responsibility is alive and kicking and still a big deal when we're studying how government and politics works. Let's take the case of Esther Morris. Esther Morris in 2002 was Education Secretary. A scandal was brewing about the number of grades going up in A-levels. Basically, A-level grades were increasing by 20% year on year. In terms of the numbers of people getting it. And it was a pretty uniform line of improvement. And the press argued that that couldn't possibly be down to better teaching, and it couldn't possibly be down to the students being better at the exams as they got used to the format. Rather, for it to be such a straight line, and a consistently straight line, it had to be being fixed. And it was being fixed, they argued, at the very highest levels to save government blushes after Tony Blair had said that his three biggest responsibilities in government were education, education, education. Esther Morris therefore came in for a lot of flack. She was already known to be having, shall we say, stress issues in the job. and she resigned with the following rather frank words in her resignation letter that was made public. In some recent situations I have been involved in, I have not felt I have been as effective as I should be, or as effective as you, she was referring to Tonti Blair, need me to be. Rumours of pressure of the post, i.e. how hard she was finding it, did circulate around the time, but her reasoning for resignation was a combination of policy and administrative failure, that she wasn't fully across her brief and therefore could not prosecute the role of Secretary of State for Education. So you can argue that we have an example here of personal ministerial responsibility in the lines of Dugdale, in the lines of Carrington. The next example to prove the point is Amber Rudd in 2018. She was Home Secretary. She'd taken over from the then Prime Minister, Theresa Human Rights are Optional May, and she inherited a series of concerns. One of these concerns were rumours that wouldn't go away that the Home Office had issued to its operatives targets on quotas for how many people should be removed and deported for immigration concerns. Amber Rudd argued, as was the government line, that no such targets were available, that these things were made up. That would be ridiculous. That would be entirely unfair and would undermine the impartiality of the Home Office and would undermine the whole point of the laws and what they were trying to deal with. To have a target to hit would mean that people weren't looking for genuine strikers and genuinely illegal immigrants, but were rather trying to fit people into a target to match a predetermined quota so that they wouldn't get sacked themselves. She went to a select committee and said that no such targets existed, whereupon she was surprised to learn that the person asking the question absolutely had evidence that they did. If you watch the video clip at the bottom there from The Guardian, it explains it very, very quickly. I had to choose The Guardian. I did try to find another one, but I couldn't. So that's the moment, apparently, that her career ended. So have a look at the video clip. It's only about 2 minutes long. Pause the video and then come back when you're done. Okay, I'm going to assume you've watched the video clip. And obviously, she'd misled Parliament. She'd told Parliament that no such targets or quotas existed. And then they did. So she said she had inadvertently misled Parliament and became aware of information provided to my office which makes mention of targets. I should have been aware of this and to take full responsibility that I was not. Because she wasn't across her brief, because she didn't know her department well enough, because she hadn't asked questions, she resigned. She was not good enough to be minister, and that's what ministers are supposed to do. This caused a bit of controversy because it was widely supposed that the Prime Minister, who even endorsed her resignation with the same words, saying you should have been across your brief and you weren't, therefore you didn't know that this was a thing in the Home Office and you should have done, had previously been Home Secretary and had authored the policy and had appointed Amber Rudd as a friend to the Home Office position, implying that really the policy was Theresa May's and her mystification about these targets was entirely disingenuous. It was an interesting crisis that eventually went nowhere. It got eclipsed by other things later in 2019, almost like it was supposed to be. But there we go. Amber Rudd basically resigned as a human shield so that the Prime Minister didn't have to. Arguably, it wasn't her fault. She could have done a Lamont and stuck on and said it was government policy, but she didn't. I'm aware of time and I do apologise. You could argue that this tendency for resignation and ministerial responsibility is waning. It's getting smaller. Let's take some examples. Let's take Gavin Williamson and let's go back to August 2020 when he was Education Secretary. I mean, he still is at the time of recording. And it was the algorithm that essentially failed to give people fair grades in August. If you remember, he'd spent much of the summer saying the algorithm would sort everything out and had reassured students and parents and Parliament the day before examination results were released that everything was fine. On the day of results, everything was not fine. He announced that there would be plans to allow for appeals. And a day later, on the Friday of that week, he said that there would be no changes to the grades apart from an appeals process. On the Saturday that week, the Ofqual produced plans that apparently seemed to come from Williamson's office, saying that students could take their mock grades instead. There's a clue in the title there, the word is mock. They're not real. This caused a bit of an outcry, and within 2 hours that advice had been taken down. Williamson was pursued for comment but said nothing. Ofqual said they were acting on the advice of the government. On the Monday, Williamson took to the airwaves and essentially said that Ofqual had come up with their own appeals process that he had long disagreed with, despite on the Saturday before the publication saying that he'd ordered it, and basically went back to centre assessed grades on the Monday, saying there was no way that they could do otherwise. The algorithm had failed. He argued that he was carrying out government policy and that there had been operational failings that had caused the problem, and promptly sacked 2 civil servants in charge of the various areas that administered the algorithm. You can find the first of his apologies for the confusion on that YouTube link there. It's from the Daily Tory Telegraph, so I think it's reasonable to go there and it's not biased. Have a look at it there and pause the video to watch that first. Okay, and then you can look at the second one, which was a day later, and he's still talking about the same issue. And you can compare the two, and these were later used why he shouldn't resign. So have a watch, see what you think. Pause the video. Okay, now the next one will take a little bit longer. I've got 7 minutes remaining, but let's see. My next example is Matt Hancock. He, of course, in 2021, announced the COVID-19 response as being a lockdown, when previously he'd said that it didn't need it. But also, and perhaps more potently, because it only happened yesterday, is this idea of as of recording, that would be the 26th of January 2021, when it was announced that we passed the figure for 100,000 people dead. In February 2020, he assured Parliament that the UK was fully prepared for any pandemic and faced no immediate danger. He further argued that there was no need for any kind of restrictions or any kind of government advice on how to deal with a pandemic that had developed in Wuhan, China. Also, test and trace, like all of last year and into this year too, the whole thing. It has consistently failed to meet targets. It has not used existing contact tracing expertise in the NHS. Rather, it's been sent without tender to private companies who he had claimed he would never use because there'd be no privatisation of the NHS on his watch. Interesting. He has not yet resigned, as of the recording of this, as he argues he's carrying out government policy and argues that it was beyond responsibility because new variants of the COVID-19 virus that have caused all this problem have been unforeseen. Now, I couldn't find him reassuring Parliament. I did see a clip on TV, but of course that's not on YouTube. So the clip I found is actually from slightly later. It's in the middle of March, not in February. In this, and if you start at that link there, you'll start a number of minutes in. I forget the exact number of minutes. And if you watch it for about 5-10 minutes, you'll see him say that there's no need for draconian measures like a lockdown, even though 53 people have already contracted the virus in Britain. Bear in mind, we already knew what had happened in Italy, and we already knew what was happening in China by this point, and how quickly it could spread. His argument was there was no need for draconian closing down because the economy took precedence, and Britain was perfectly prepared to deal with it with all supplies necessary. So, if you have a watch of that video clip for about 10 minutes, you'll see why some people have argued that Matt Hancock ought to have resigned through at least administrative failure, but possibly also through policy failure. His argument is he was following government policy, and any administrative failures are due to changes in the way the virus operates and behaves and variants that were simply unforeseen. No one could have done better. See what you think, pause the video and have a look at his explanation. I'm going to assume you've watched that, and I'll finish up with personal conduct. Now, I'm not going to have time to talk this through, which is a shame, so I want to talk about Chris Huhne, but I recognise that the examples are taking a particularly long time. And you've also had to watch a lot of video clips. So trying to keep this as close to half an hour as I can, with video clips included, I'm going to stop at this point, and thank you, if you have been, for watching, and also wish you a good rest of day, and I shall be in touch later. Thursday's lesson will talk about some of the examples, and I may even bring in the personal examples of Chris Huhne, Michael Fallon and Priti Patel in that lesson. We'll see how we go. We'll see if we get to it. And if we don't, I'll record a lesson for Tuesday based on that, and hopefully move on to collective ministerial responsibility as well. I've now gone over 30 minutes, but not to worry. Thank you very much for your time. Have a lovely afternoon, and I shall see you tomorrow for the live Teams lesson.